In the late years of the Roman Republic, marriage was not a private bond. It was a civic mechanism, a contract recognized by law, overseen by custom, and absorbed into the machinery of the state. What occurred within it did not belong to the couple alone. It belonged to Rome. The ceremony began in daylight. Witnesses gathered, legal words were spoken, hands were joined. But Rome did not believe a marriage existed until night had passed. Until the household had proven obedience to ritual older than memory. The wedding night was not celebration. It was confirmation. Rome governed through symbols, through repetition, through acts performed not because they were questioned, but because they were inherited. The marriage rite followed this logic with precision. Each movement reinforced hierarchy. Each silence carried instruction. The bride, often young, was transferred from one authority to another, from father to husband, from one household ledger to the next. This transfer was not symbolic alone. It was enacted. The bride did not walk freely into her new home. Tradition required resistance, not genuine struggle, but visible hesitation. Her reluctance affirmed that she had been claimed, not chosen. The household needed to see this. The neighbors needed to hear it. The ritual communicated that Rome did not permit unregulated desire. Order preceded affection. Women were expected to learn this immediately. Inside the domus, the household assembled. Lamps were lit low. Older women guided the bride forward. Younger ones were excluded. Men waited beyond the threshold. The space was controlled, regulated, observed. Rome documented everything except what it did not wish remembered. What survives in fragments suggests a rite intended to strip the bride of autonomy while preserving dignity through silence. No records describe acts. They describe rules, posture, position, who could speak, who could not. The absence is deliberate. The bride's hair was arranged in a specific style, divided by a ceremonial spear tip, an object tied to conquest, not union. The message was clear. This was not romance. This was incorporation into Roman order. The bed was prepared before nightfall. It was placed under the authority of household gods, witnessed by tokens, not people. Objects replaced observers. Rome trusted symbols more than testimony. Once the doors closed, the household withdrew, but not fully. Older women remained nearby. Their presence enforced continuity. What had been done to them would now be done again, not in detail, but in structure. The night did not belong to those inside it. Roman writers later referred to the wedding night in coded language. Euphemisms, metaphors, phrases stripped of description. The lack of clarity was not ignorance. It was policy. Explicit record would invite judgment. Implication ensured obedience without debate. Marriage in Rome created citizens, legitimate heirs, property lines, political alliances. The bride's body became a site of state interest, not individually but institutionally. This is where Rome was most careful. The ritual emphasized endurance, not emotion. Silence, not expression. The bride was expected to remain composed. Any display of fear or refusal disrupted the narrative of order. Such disruption was unacceptable. There are hints, only hints, that the night included symbolic acts meant to assert dominance rather than intimacy. Gestures repeated across generations, justified as tradition, shielded by age. No single document explains it fully, but multiple sources agree on one thing: the rite was compulsory. Refusal carried consequence. Social, legal, familial. Rome did not punish the ritual, it punished deviation. The following morning completed the process. The bride emerged transformed. No longer daughter, now matrona. Her status changed publicly. The household acknowledged her role. The city accepted the outcome. What happened inside the night was no longer relevant, only that it had occurred. This structure protected the institution, not the individuals. It allowed Rome to maintain continuity while denying scrutiny. By the time imperial reforms softened some customs, the core logic remained intact. Power does not disappear, it rephrases itself. Later Roman authors expressed discomfort with older rites. Some dismissed them as archaic. Others implied excess without detail. None described abolition. Silence suggests continuation, not erasure. The ritual survived because it was never named plainly. It existed in implication, passed from household to household, taught quietly, enforced socially. The state did not need to intervene. The institution maintained itself. This is the nature of control systems that last. They do not rely on violence alone. They rely on expectation, on normalization, on the belief that what has always been done must always be done. By the time Rome attempted to present itself as civilized to the world it conquered, many such customs were quietly minimized in official accounts. The image mattered. The archive was curated. But rituals do not vanish because records do. They persist where authority benefits. The wedding night rite was not designed to shock. It was designed to instruct, to mark boundaries, to ensure that from the first night hierarchy was internalized. The bride learned her place not through force but through inevitability. This is what makes the ritual difficult to isolate. It does not appear as an event. It appears as a process, a passage enforced by tradition, shielded by silence. Rome did not need to erase it loudly, it only needed to stop speaking of it. And so the custom faded from text but not from structure. Its logic echoed in later legal codes, in expectations of obedience. In the framing of marriage as submission wrapped in ceremony, what remains now is a pattern, reconstructed from fragments, supported by absence. A ritual powerful enough that Rome no longer needed to explain it. But the absence itself raises a question. What exactly was so necessary that it could not be described, yet could not be abandoned? The answer does not appear in daylight. It waits where Rome preferred no record exist, in the night. When a ritual is repeated across centuries, its survival depends not on belief but on infrastructure. Marriage in Rome was not sustained by affection or faith. It was sustained by law, property, and documentation. The wedding night rite existed within this framework, not as an anomaly but as a reinforcing mechanism. Its function was administrative. Roman legal texts defined marriage as a transfer of authority, manus, control. The bride passed from the legal power of her father into that of her husband. This transfer required acknowledgement, not emotion. The night served as confirmation that authority had changed hands. Nothing needed to be written because everything had already been decided. Households operated as micro-institutions. Each domus enforced Roman order without direct state presence. Elders taught the customs. Women instructed younger women. Silence preserved compliance. The ritual did not need enforcement by soldiers. It was enforced by expectation. Sources from jurists describe marriage as incomplete until consummated, yet they avoid detailing how that confirmation was ensured. This absence is structural. It suggests that the method was standardized enough to require no explanation. Everyone already knew. That knowledge was contained within households, not archives. Women who entered marriage understood the expectations long before the ceremony. Preparation began early, not in instruction manuals but in observation. They watched older women return from their wedding nights altered in status, tone, and visibility. The change was immediate and unmistakable. The system relied on anticipation. The night itself was not isolated. It was surrounded by supervision. The bride was escorted, positioned, left within reach of oversight. The physical space mattered. Roman homes were designed for visibility and control. Private rooms were rare. Walls were thin. Movement was monitored. Privacy was a modern concept. Rome did not require it. The ritual's power came from its predictability. It followed an exact order, the same phrases spoken, the same objects placed, the same expectations enforced. Deviation signaled disorder. Disorder threatened inheritance. Marriage secured lineage. Lineage secured power. Any uncertainty regarding the transfer of authority compromised the system. The wedding night eliminated ambiguity. It closed the transaction. This is why the ritual endured even as Rome transformed politically. Republic gave way to empire, emperors replaced senators, but households remained, and households preserved the right. Later, legal reforms attempted to soften the language of domination. Consent became more visible in texts, yet the underlying structure remained unchanged. Authority still transferred. The night still confirmed it. What Rome adjusted was not the practice, but the narrative. The state increasingly presented marriage as mutual, but enforcement stayed domestic. By shifting responsibility to families, Rome protected itself from accountability. If harm occurred, it was tradition's fault, not law's. The system insulated power. There are references to disputes arising when a bride resisted the rite. These cases rarely favored the woman. Resistance implied noncompliance. Noncompliance implied disorder. Disorder implied threat. Threats were neutralized quietly. Records show women being returned to their fathers for correction or placed under stricter guardianship. The ritual was not optional. It was expected completion of marriage. Failure had consequences. What remains striking is how little moral debate appears in Roman discourse. The ritual was not questioned ethically. It was evaluated functionally. Did it secure lineage? Did it maintain order? Did it reinforce authority? If yes, it remained. Roman writers who expressed discomfort did so cautiously. They framed older customs as excessive, not wrong. They suggested refinement, not elimination. Reform, not abolition. This language reveals fear. To dismantle the ritual would require confronting the logic of authority itself. Rome was unwilling to do that. The state could survive conquest, corruption, civil war, but not destabilization of its social hierarchy. The wedding night was one of its quietest stabilizers. It taught obedience without legislation. It enforced hierarchy without force. It transformed individuals into roles. This is why documentation fades. Writing invites interpretation. Interpretation invites challenge. Silence preserves function. Even as Christianity later absorbed Roman marriage structures, it inherited the framework rather than dismantling it. The language changed. The expectations did not. Authority remained gendered. Submission remained implied. The Roman system proved adaptable. What had once been ritualized openly became internalized. Women no longer needed to be instructed explicitly. They were conditioned through culture. By the time Rome's political power declined, the rite no longer required defense. It had already succeeded. The night had done its work. What we see now is not a missing description, but a completed operation. The ritual achieved its goal so thoroughly that Rome no longer needed to speak of it. And yet traces remain, in legal phrasing, in inheritance laws, in the persistent framing of marriage as transfer rather than union. These are echoes, not accidents. The ritual was not erased because it failed, it was erased because it worked. When systems function perfectly, they disappear from view. But disappearance is not absence, it is concealment, and concealment leaves patterns. The deeper one studies Roman marriage, the clearer it becomes that the wedding night was not an intimate moment, it was an institutional checkpoint, a final verification. A closed door behind which Rome confirmed that its order would continue another generation. Nothing dramatic needed to occur, only compliance. And compliance, once achieved, requires no record, which leaves only one remaining question. If the ritual was so essential, why did Rome eventually stop naming it? The answer lies not in reform, but in fear. Because once named, it could be judged, and judgment is something empires avoid. By the later centuries of Roman rule, the wedding night ritual no longer appeared as a defined practice. No decree abolished it, no reform erased it. It vanished instead through omission, removed from language while preserved in outcome. This was not mercy, it was strategy. Rome had learned that the most durable systems are those no longer visible as systems. Once a ritual no longer needs explanation, it has already succeeded. The wedding night had completed its purpose. Authority was internalized, compliance was assumed, silence replaced enforcement. What remained was structure. Marriage continued to function as transfer. Lineage continued to be protected. Women continued to move from one authority to another under the language of duty and order. The rite itself was no longer named because it no longer needed to be. Rome had trained society to perform it without instruction. Later moral frameworks arrived, philosophical, religious, imperial, but they did not dismantle the foundation. They layered new meanings over old mechanics. Words like virtue, honor, and sanctity entered the narrative. The structure beneath them remained Roman. This is how power survives transformation. Christian writers inherited Roman marriage law almost intact. They criticized excess but preserved hierarchy. They removed explicit reference to domination while maintaining its function. Submission became spiritual rather than legal. Obedience became moral rather than civic. The wedding night disappeared as ritual and reappeared as expectation. No witnesses, no ceremony, no language of conquest, only assumption. By this stage, Rome no longer required symbols. The spear was gone. The household elders withdrew. The doors closed without supervision. But the outcome remained the same. The bride emerged changed. What Rome erased was not the practice, but the evidence. Archives grew selective. Histories became curated. The empire wished to be remembered as lawful, civilized, ordered. Certain customs no longer fit that image. They were not denied. They were ignored. Silence became Rome's final defense. This silence extended into modern historical study. Scholars found gaps. Ambiguities, fragmented references without explanation. The absence was often treated as loss. It was not loss, it was design. Rome understood that future judgment could not be controlled if records survived. By allowing the ritual to dissolve into implication, the empire protected itself from retrospective scrutiny. No description meant no indictment, and so the wedding night became invisible, but systems leave residues. They persist in law, in language, in assumptions carried forward without source. Marriage across centuries continued to privilege authority over mutuality. The logic of transfer endured. Consent was framed within expectation. Silence was normalized. These were not accidents of culture. They were wrong. The most disturbing aspect of the ritual is not what it required, but how effectively it erased itself. a practice so integrated into social order that it no longer needed to be enforced, a control mechanism so complete that it vanished into tradition. Rome did not destroy it. Rome outgrew the need to mention it. By the time the empire fractured, the ritual had already fulfilled its purpose. Its echoes lived on in successor societies, unrecognized as inheritance. This is the mark of successful institutional control. Not terror, not spectacle, but normalization. What began as ceremony ended as assumption, and assumptions are the hardest forms of power to challenge, because they do not announce themselves, they do not demand obedience, they expect it. The wedding night ritual is remembered now not through detail but through consequence, through patterns repeated long after Rome fell, through structures that survived without attribution. The empire collapsed, the system endured. That is the legacy Rome left behind, not marble, not law codes, but invisible order. The ritual was horrifying not because of what it did in a single night, but because of what it taught permanently. That authority could be absorbed, that silence could replace resistance. That control did not need witnesses. Rome tried to erase the ritual from history because it no longer needed history to sustain it. But erasure is never complete. Traces remain for those willing to look past the archive and into the structure itself, where the empire still whispers, not in words, but in the echo of expectation.